So this is part of a workshop series, Research at Work, Science Policy 101, and we're excited to have everyone here today to talk about policy for science. We'd like to thank the U of T SGS Sponsorship Fund for supporting this event. For a quick outline, we're going to do this intro for about 5 minutes. Then we'll have our talk and discussion with our keynote, Dr. Imogen Coe. And that's going to have discussion mixed in with the talk. Then if we have time, we'll do quick question and answer with the audience, and we'll have a 5-minute closing remarks with our president, Don Bannerman. A few housekeeping. Everyone probably knows Zoom controls by this point, but note that the event is being recorded and will be posted to YouTube afterwards. There's live captioning so that if anyone needs that, and that's visible here, you can see the arrow and it says show subtitle, and that will give you the closed captioning. TSPN would also like to acknowledge that we're hosting this event on the traditional lands of many Indigenous nations. The Greater Toronto Area is located on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. It's now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We encourage each of you to learn more about the Indigenous nations on whose land you currently work and live. And we'd also just like to remind everyone that we have a strict no harassment policy at all of our events. A little bit about who we are. The Toronto Science Policy Network is a student-run science policy group. We're based out of the University of Toronto. We aim to provide a platform for students and postdocs to learn more about and engage in science policy. TSPN is open to all disciplines and is inclusive of all areas of research. Since July 2018, we've organized a variety of events engaging hundreds of individuals to date. We work with the community to advocate for evidence-based policy and to promote discussions on the science behind key policies. We do all of this through workshops, talks, panels, and campaigns. And there's a link in the chat if you are interested in learning more. So there's 3 questions we want you to consider as we talk about what science policy is. This is a 101 workshop, so we're going to teach you a little bit about basics of science policy. Let's look at these questions as you ask that question about what science policy is. The term science policy can be used to define a few different things. One is the way that science is governed and how resources are allocated. It can also describe how policy is based on evidence from scientific research, but in either case, it's the interface that we see between science and policy. It's important because it has a significant impact on the way that society functions. We've created this map to help make sense of how all of this works, and so we're just going to show you that now. If you were here for the last Policy 101, then Bryn discussed all of the ways that scientific research can be implemented to be used for policy. And just to cover that briefly, because it was already done so well, there's 3 main pathways that we see through which science is disseminated. There's to the other scientists, to the public, and to policymakers. Ultimately, there's many pathways within that lead to implementation, which occurs through the scientific body of knowledge, public knowledge, technology, or policy. What we're going to talk about now is how policy can affect science. So the 4 main components of knowledge translation loop back to inform what research is conducted next. What is known scientifically informs the next questions that can then be asked. what the public is interested in also contributes to what is studied. The technology and tools that are available define what research can be done. So this last pathway here, the yellow at the bottom, is how policy informs scientific research. And that's what we'll have our speaker talk about today. So if we look a little bit more closely at this pathway of policy for science, policy can be directed toward the research or the researchers, but in either case, it influences the type, amount, and quality of scientific research that's conducted. Sorry, one second. Okay. And so in this one, and this image, you can see that we're focusing on this topic for today, policy for science. And some important concepts are involved in policy for science are these aspects. So we have principles like open science, we have scientific integrity, which is important for informing research. We have funding, which can include grants, funding for graduate students, and it also is important for determining the kinds of research that can be done. What we're going to hear about today is equity, diversity, and inclusion, and how consideration of EDI is really important for science. And then lastly, graduate training is part of this pathway because it is important as an aspect of scientific research. So now that we've oriented ourselves to where policy for science fits into the science policy interface, and more broadly, the science translation map, I'd like to introduce our wonderful speaker that we have here today. So if everyone wants to give a warm welcome to Dr. Imogen Coe. And let me just use this really quickly. Okay. So Dr. Imogen Coe is a professor of chemistry and biology and founding dean of the Faculty of Science at Toronto Metropolitan University. She's also an affiliate scientist at St. Michael's Hospital, Toronto. Dr. Coe is well known as one of Canada's leading advocates for organizational change towards inclusive excellence in research, particularly in science and medicine. She runs a consulting company providing advice and training on inclusive excellence and has advised federal and national funding agencies on how to integrate equity, diversity, and inclusion principles into diverse research cultures. Dr. Coe is the inaugural NSERC Scholar in Residence. She's published widely on these topics and is much in demand as a speaker and a panelist. She's received numerous awards for her advocacy work and more recently, the 2022 Canadian Science Policy Centered Trailblazer Policy for Science Award. So thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Coe. I'll give you the floor so that you can share your experiences in science policy.
Great, thank you so much. Let me just make sure I can find everybody. Okay, so I just have to move you over here. No, that's right over there. So I hope that you can see my screen now with the title. Can somebody give me a thumbs up? Yes, you can see. Yeah, okay, great. Thank you so much for inviting me. I hope you had a wonderful session with Jeff. He's quite brilliant and very knowledgeable, and it's always a thrill to particularly to talk to next generation scientists. So I hope that today, just a little tiny kind of high level flyover of sort of how policy interventions can be used to create inclusive cultures and why this is important as a national strategic priority. So I would rearrange that little map that you showed, and I'd actually move EDI up to the front of all of those other aspects because it kind of infuses everything. I am also based in Southern Ontario. This is where I am, and thank you for acknowledging that we're all doing work on land that's been lived on for thousands of years. But I'm going to immediately ask you a question, and maybe you can use the chat to answer this. How can a land acknowledgement be related to policies that impact science in Canada? So that's a kind of a meaty question, but we hear land acknowledgements all the time. And I think we've become used to them and we don't think about them quite as much as we should. So I'm challenging you now to think, how does land acknowledgement, how does thinking about Indigenous science relate to policies, particularly perhaps around things like EDI, when we're thinking about science? How do you reflect on that? Anybody got any thoughts or ideas there? When you hear a land acknowledgement as perhaps a science student or as somebody working in a sort of, fast-paced biomedical research lab, how does it relate to you? Or does it? Or maybe do you struggle a little bit to figure out what it might actually mean? I see Natasha, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, for me, I mean, land acknowledgements are very different from university to university. But in terms of like where I've seen it in my own community, it being used as a recognition of how the role of colonization, how science has played a role in colonization as well, and moving towards a less transactional kind of science with, like, when we were working collaboratively with Indigenous groups, less it being transactional and more going towards co-design of research.
Absolutely. So yeah, great answer. Great reflection there. I see Frank also in ensuring Indigenous governance of data. So it really, it changes if we think about how people have been trying to understand the world around them, whether they're in North America or Africa or Australasia. There's enormous value in recognizing that there's a fundamental paradigm shift that frames Indigenous scholarship in terms of understanding the world. So I want you to take away this difference between the Eurocentric Western forms of science, which is what many of us have been trained in, and which is the research system, the science system that we have in Canada because of our colonial sort of adoption of Eurocentric ways, compared to Indigenous scholarship in which the observer is part of the observed. So it really differentiates between the relational aspect of who's involved in doing science, who's involved in figuring out how we're going to understand these things, compared to what is a very separated, arm's length Eurocentric approach, which contributes, we know, research science, our social science colleagues can tell us this and show us this observer as the unemotional, sort of objective scientist, this contributes to the myth of objectivity that skews our real ability to get to the best quality science. So we get a fuller understanding of our world if we use a broader approach and a calibrated perspective. So when we're thinking about science in particular, the way various people around the world have been doing science for thousands and thousands of years is worth us thinking about, because it'll help us do better science. Now, I am not an Indigenous scholar. I recognize that I also don't have a background in gender studies or human rights law. So why am I somebody who doesn't spend a lot of time talking about things like policy and EDI? Well, you know these things about me. I am a scientist. I've done all of those things that a scientist is supposed to do, which is get grants, write papers, supervise graduate students. But I'm also an advocate, and you don't have to be one or the other. I really think that we still have this messaging in this country, which is, you need to just focus on the science. You can be a very effective scientist and advocate. I would go like I'm an activist. I've been an advisor. And you can do all of the things that, are sort of the measures of the way we treat scientists, in that you can write about these things, you can learn about the scholarship, you can learn about the research, and you can be a scientist. So published papers in science, but I've also published papers on other aspects in places like you would recognize for, science. And this can be very impactful and can be very helpful if you are trying to affect policy. So coming from a scientist background, but really learning about the material and learning about the field and then applying that back towards science can be incredibly effective. It can be very satisfying, it can be very rewarding. And while we know the impact factors are rubbish and nonsense, my highest, the impact factor for the Lancet, I only just discovered this very recently, is this ridiculous number, 202.731, 3 decimal places for an impact factor. It's absolutely bonkers. But you can sort of play the game in the sense of, well, you know what, if you're going to use impact factors as a metric, then here, look, I'm actually doing what it is that you claim is the thing that, that specifies excellence or whatever. So I really encourage you to push back against the stick to the science when science gets political. Anybody heard this? Anybody been getting sort of these kind of comments when you're engaged with science policy, or anybody sort of having to explain themselves in the lab to other people? It's still something that we're a little bit challenged with in Canada when we compare to some of our colleagues in the UK or the US, but it's really that we need to understand that we can differentiate between the science that we're doing. And I love this particular quote from Tim Minchin, which is, it's a word we use to describe how we organize our curiosity. So it's a methodology. Yes, I love science. It helps us explain the world. How we can really not fool ourselves is another quote. But human beings are flawed and are by nature political animals. So anything that human beings do, anything that we do as human beings inevitably is political. This quote, anybody know who this quote is from? Anybody with a little bit of philosophy? This is from Aristotle, okay? So human beings have been creative and contributing and figuring out things and thinking about things, but they've been doing it in a way within societies that are by nature political, and science is the same. So science is a rigorous way of not fooling ourselves, but it's done by human beings who are very flawed. So we need to include that in the way we think about science, which is why having the observer as part of the observed is very helpful. And I really encourage everybody to actually get involved more in policy. I had somebody ask me the other day, what can I do to sort of, help increase the number of women in physics or whatever? And it's like, I'll do more camps. And really, it is the political activity, and political not meaning, waving flags or particular voting. It's the activity around policy, and scientists being engaged in policy is really very important. So why is science important as a national strategic priority? I think, Jeff would have said it is, but why is it? I'm hoping you learned something from Jeff. Anything? Why is it important? Why should any average taxpaying Canadian care about science? Oh, quiet. Ideas? Thoughts? Okay, well, it's because it's an economic issue, right? It's a quality of life issue. It's a security issue. Our competitors on the global sort of market see that things like AI, quantum computing are really important national priorities, the UK strategic priority. A lot of discussion in Canada right now about things like pharmaceutical security. Report just came out of came out last year of the C.D. Howe Institute. Serious shortage in science skills. So labor market issues, security, reliability, sustainability, civil and healthy society, foundational democracy. So science, the doing of science is really very important as a national strategic priority. And if we look at life sciences, then this is there's a report that just came out today. I didn't put it here, but we know that government, who funds the science research ecosystem, is very concerned about finding the best and the brightest ideas, finding the best and the brightest innovators and innovations, the strongest economic drivers in discovery. It's really important to remember that this is the way that the government thinks in terms of what is the role of science. So we want the best, we want the next hot thing, we want to be sure we've got jobs, we want to make sure that we can make our own vaccines, we want to make sure we get vaccines, we want to make sure we have the best possible, most rigorous approach to agriculture, to all of these kinds of things. So it's about really wanting the best and the brightest, and wanting innovations and wanting economic drivers. There's a tension there between the basic research and the direction, but it still is the way that policymakers will think about these things. So they want the best and the brightest. They want the drivers, the discovery. And where does the best science come from? It comes from creating inclusive and diverse cultures that support innovation, creativity, and risk-taking. So if you want the best and the brightest, if you want innovation, if you want risk-taking, if you want creativity, then you have to create environments that bring all of that together, that foster that, that support that, that enable that, and that facilitate that. That's why we want EDI-infused research cultures. It's about getting the best and doing the best and getting better and getting more diverse ideas and more creativity, and creating cultures where people can be innovative and take risks. So there's two questions I want you to sort of to go away with. One is, it matters who does the research, because who does the research, whether it's an individual teams, will influence the questions that are being asked. It'll influence how the debate is framed. If you have diverse teams, you don't get groupthink, you don't get homogeneous ways of doing things. Who does the research can also influence who interprets the data, who decides on priorities, who decides on resource allocation, who builds the teams. I'm just going to have people that look like me, and then we're all going to, agree on things that that all come from our similar experience. That's not the most creative kind of environment. It's also not necessarily, it might be a very safe environment, but it's not going to necessarily foster risk taking. So there's lots of ways about who does the research that can influence how good the research is. And we want the best. We're a small population in a big country competing on a global scale. So we can't afford to miss the best. We want to make sure that we have all the best ideas. So we're talking about inclusive excellence in researchers is one of the reasons we want EDI-infused research environments. And there's lots of examples of where more diverse teams have led to different kinds of questions. We wrote about it a few years back in the agriculture kind of research world, where it was a very male-dominated community that was sort of dismissing the noise that came with maternal genetic contributions. That was noise in crop breeding, but actually it's plasticity, which could actually be advantageous. So different ways of thinking about things. This is another really interesting article. I don't like the title of this article because reimagining animal behavior through a feminist lens. They're just imagining it because they're from a different perspective, because they're challenging old-fashioned ways of thinking about animal behavior, which are very influenced by, the dominance of white men in that field, and also the sort of hangover from Victorian era in terms of thinking about things like reproduction. So challenging old assumptions and asking newer questions actually leads to better science, right? So we want to really be sure that we're diversifying who's doing the science. And how do we currently select the best scientists? It's from within this traditional window of selection processes and approaches. So if our window of selection processes is defined by a set of policies, then we're almost certainly limiting who we're actually selecting in terms of the best. Let's say we know that talent is spread across humanity. We've got some definition of excellence, but we've got a narrow window of ways we select people. We're hiring 7 people. So, okay, we've got these 4, they exceed the bar, but we haven't widened the way we do things. So we're actually start to maybe drop down a little bit. And there is some research out there that suggests if you're not intentionally scanning for talent, you could be embedding mediocrity. So we want to be thinking about what sort of policies can impact these types of actions. So if I were to give you this, what are the policies? There could be, look, just as I go through this, what other ones might you be familiar with? So we can look at things like hiring policies. Are they infused with inclusive ways of doing things? We can look at recruitment policies. how do we hand out our awards? As the president, former president of CSMB, Canadian Society of Molecular Biosciences, I went through our entire awards processes and our descriptions, and I rewrote them to ensure that they were inclusive, because for 50 years, top scientist in Canada had always been going to a man, and then there was an award for women in science. Well, theoretically, you know, you could have lots of top scientists in Canada that would be women. And when we actually rewrote those awards, what do you know? And actually put in a rigorous rubric so that we could actually know, what are you defining by the different criteria? What do you know? Different makeup of people were started to get those awards. So there can be things that you may be aware of in, you know, whatever your environment is, that are policies that are exclusionary in practice. So if anybody has any, let me know what your experience is. These are our policies. They are, I like to use scientific analogies. I talk to scientists and engineers a lot. They're demographic exclusion, chromatography. These are our policies. They're policies that select against all sorts of historically excluded groups, which make up a significant chunk of humanity. And we know that talent and ideas and creativity are spread across humanity. So we want to be sure that we can actually access that talent, that human capital, which is in people's brains and their ideas. It's not a leaky pipeline. Some people describe it as a glass obstacle course. But these things that hold back groups, these are often policies. So what are the policies around you that you may be aware of? You might want to think about that, or if something comes to mind right away, let me know. Put up your hand or put it in the chat. A lot of students, a lot of graduate students and postdocs. Policies. I've heard recently somebody was telling me about the sort of parental leave policy at their institution. These are things that are policies, right? So they're defined, they're written down. So these are things that if they're written down, then you can challenge them and you can say, we need to update that policy because it's not inclusive by design. Particularly things like admissions into grad school, that kind of thing. So this is a holistic approach to graduate school from the University of Washington in the US. It is designed from first principles to say old-fashioned ways or old ways of doing admissions for graduate school are not inclusive. They're exclusionary. They're limited. That's that narrow window. So they have gone through, and I like the description here, summary of promising practices, to restructure their policies around admission to make them inclusive. We can also do this. We're a little slow to doing this in Canada. There are some places that are further ahead. Certainly in my institution, they're looking at holistic admissions processes. There are holistic admission processes for the law school now. Time and resource intensive, but much, much fairer. And how do we select graduate students? Yeah, who gets to sit on committees? Yes. Is there a policy in place? Maybe there's no policy in place. So, we can either develop a policy from inclusive principles, or we can look at the policy and say, now that needs to be updated. When we select graduate students, this is classic, and this actually was put together by a colleague in engineering. Who are we recruiting for postdocs? The candidate with the most accomplishments? What does that actually mean? Candidate, or do we want the candidate with the most talent and potential? Or do we want the candidate who advances the state of the group? Well, he's an engineer, so of course he came up with a little equation. So let's say accomplishments are talent plus opportunity plus time. Well, if you rearrange that, then talent, and remember there's a big shortfall in talent is what we're being told. Talent is what we want for creativity and risk-taking and ideas, and that's what we want as an economic driver. Talent then is accomplishments minus opportunity minus time. And obviously then how you're going to evaluate that is going to be a little bit different. So Erica's mentioning, yes, volunteers, right? So when I was a chair of a department and also as a dean, I really tried to clamp down on volunteering. Volunteering is a proxy for privilege. So if if a student wants experience, that's fabulous. And lots of people want experience, want students to get experience. So what we did in one place was we created a course. So it was a research practicum course. The students got academic credit. It went on their transcripts, and maybe you can pay them, but they got credit for it. In other situations, it's like, no, you need to hire them as a research assistant and we'll find some money from somewhere. So volunteering is something that I think is really problematic because people should be compensated for their time. And vast majority of my undergraduates at my institution are working, and they can't just take time for working for free. So volunteerism is a good example. We have here institutional policy as exclusionary practice. Here's Queen's University. It was in their policies to say Black students were not allowed to go to medical school. Wasn't until that was there for about almost 100 years until Ed Thomas found it in the books, and they went to Senate and actually had it removed officially. Now it's a learning opportunity. Now everybody understands this is racist. This is embedded racism, structural racism. We have exclusionary design in how we actually build our spaces. And because of exclusionary design, we in Ontario have the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. So there is policy that says, no, you cannot build buildings that are inaccessible. And that can be, ramped seating, or it can be, it's just unwelcoming because we have the white dude walls of honor. So, maybe a policy to have inclusive environments, but certainly policies on structure, because many of our science environments are not accessible. But remember that the AODA is only about 4 provinces in Canada that actually have policy legislation to ensure accessibility for people with disabilities. So there's work to be done. Some of the most challenging places where we try to get policy interventions to reduce impacts of things like sexism, racism are in behaviors. So we all have, because we're humans, we all have behaviors. We all have those things that we call implicit bias. I don't like that term. We have cultural conditioning. Our brains take shortcuts because of the way we were raised, because of the messages we grew up with, because of all sorts of things. So we all have those shortcuts. So now we have, training. I'm often asked by, particularly my graduate students, can you make EDI training mandatory for faculty members? That would be great, but it's very hard to make those things mandatory. But what you can do, and some of the things I've been involved in, is to set expectations and have accountability and consequences as policy. So an example would be the NSERC discovery grants over the years, because of people like me and others really saying you need to ensure inclusive environments, training environments for graduate students and postdocs and undergraduates. You need to require them to be written in. You incentivize by saying, if it's not there, you won't get money. And then you need to evaluate and follow up to make sure that you actually achieve your end goal. So incentivization towards the behaviors can be designed as a policy. I like to present it as a recalibration, because I don't like implicit bias. Bias is very judgy. I think it's just the way our brains are wired, but we can calibrate, we can recalibrate. And so volunteerism has been mentioned. We also know that GPAs can be reflective of embedded structures of oppression. CVs, we know there's whitewashing of CVs. We know that male and female CVs are viewed differently. Letters of reference, lots of research and data and evidence to say all of these things are skewed. So we can have policies that say we're going to have a holistic admissions process, or we can have policies that say we're not going to use letters of reference in hiring until the end of the hiring process. And it's just like having all the machines in your lab. So I'm a biochemist, so we want to purify a particular protein out of a mixture. If every one of my machines was 5% miscalibrated, if it was 5% off, I wouldn't say, and I knew it was 5% off, all of them, I wouldn't say, oh yes, what comes out at the end is the most rigorous, the best thing, the best output I could possibly have. That would be a really crappy scientist. So if we know that the systems we have in place are slightly skewed, if they're not the most rigorous, the most equitable, the most accurate ways that we can do things, then we would be foolish, either as individuals or as groups or as institutions or as policymakers, to not try to correct those things on the basis of evidence and data and research that says we can do it better. So our brains are the things that need calibrating, as if we were calibrating all the machines in our labs. Yes, also an example at Queen's of some of the poor implementation of policy decisions. So implementation science is a thing that we really need to pay a lot of attention to as well. So it's who does the research, and that influences how the research is done. So the second of the two questions to go away with, we're thinking about, how do we infuse research culture or science with EDI principles? It's like, well, who's doing it? And what are the policies that can be adjusted or introduced to make sure more people are doing it? And then how is it being done? And the first question then is going to influence the second, but is the research being done in an inclusive or sex and gender-based analysis plus approach, which reflects experimental rigor? I have to say, I review for a huge number of granting agencies, and if you can't tell me why SGBA Plus is or isn't relevant in your research proposal, that to me speaks to your ability to be a really effective top quality scientist. So EDI infused, that's EDI and accessibility infused research design leads to higher quality outputs. And if you don't know how to do that, then you shouldn't be getting funding. So the strongest grants are the ones that say things like, I'll be using male and female mice, or I don't need to use male mice because we're focusing on this, or it doesn't matter. I'm using C. elegans. They're an excellent, excellent model for what I'm doing because of this. SGBA Plus is or isn't relevant. Do you know the sex of your cell lines? Have you included end users in your research? Engineers often will, forget about designing the next great wheelchair, but they actually haven't got anybody on their team who is a wheelchair user. Developing new transport methodologies, AI, machine learning. If you don't have a diverse team, or you're not engaging with the community or the end users or like a diverse team, then the research is not as good. You are not a rigorous researcher. And we have lots and lots of examples of poor quality research, which is based on, flawed databases or minimal databases. They're all Eurocentric databases, poorly designed clinical trials, long history in medicine of poorly designed clinical trials. And that is bad quality science. That is bad science, and we shouldn't be funding it. So we want to have policies in place to make sure you are required to ensure that you are using the most rigorous and inclusive ways of doing things. And that's what rigorous science is. We also want to be sure that we're creating the cultures that allow people to be safe. So there's a lot of focus right now in this country on sort of numerical diversity, but less on ensuring that once you've got those diverse teams, they're actually in places where people can be, as Needy Bala says here, boldly innovative. So we want to have environments where we have trust. But another thing I would encourage people to think about, and if you haven't heard of the concept of psychological safety, it's absolutely essential that we create these inclusive cultures, and more diverse teams will have more tension and friction. That's a known. So you have to plan for it, but we can create environments where people experience psychological safety, and then you have the most high-performing teams. You get the best outputs, you get the best ideas, you get the best things happening. So we want to really also be working towards cultures of psychological safety, and so these are some of the things that I talk about when I do training sessions, or when we talk about creating EDI-infused cultures so that people can actually be as productive, as successful, as creative, as innovative as possible. When we don't have those things, then we can have apathy, we can have sort of complacency, lots of examples of scientific fraud, low quality outputs coming from cultures where there's fear, where there's anxiety. We want to ensure that people, particularly PIs, particularly leaders, particularly team leaders, actually have the training, actually learn the skills, have the tools and the strategies, because there are a set of tools that will allow them to do these things as leaders. So it falls back on people who are leading those kinds of groups. There's a lot of focus on if you are a member of a historically excluded group, bringing you in is going to solve the problem. And I just got back from the UK. I would say if you want to look at an example of where diverse representation is not synonymous with an EDI infused culture, I would say look at British politics. So there are lots of people from different backgrounds, people who are Black, brown, people from other communities who have expressions of some of the most sort of cruel immigration strategies, or some of the most sort of doubling down on institutionalized racism. Diverse representation is not synonymous with EDI expertise. So it's really important that people learn the core competencies, people develop the core competencies in what does an EDI infused culture look like? How do you get there? What does the data tell us? What does the research tell us about how to ensure that we're actually creating those inclusive cultures, that we're creating EDI infused research cultures and EDI infused research through policy mechanisms, through training, through other kinds of approaches. But policy is really important because it's something that can have an accountability. It's not a nice to have, it's the policy. You need to follow the policy. Another thing that is really helpful, I think, is understanding the importance of intellectual humility. We are all learning, we all make mistakes. Making mistakes is part of developing the skill set. And particularly for leaders, I recommend that they look at Deloitte's 6 signature traits of inclusive leadership. We always have to be curious, and we can't just be complacent. A lot of complacency in Canadian sort of policy and science. We need to have courage. You need to take a risk, because talking about some of these things, talking about racism in science is difficult. It can be very uncomfortable. It's a long, it's a marathon, not a sprint. So some really good sort of materials that can be useful. And then not fooling ourselves. You'll hear this all the time, that somehow it's a meritocracy. I only hire people on the basis of excellence. I don't see color. I just look at the CVs. I think number of papers and journal impact factor is the most important thing. All of these things are flawed because we have a body of evidence and research that points that out, and we can do better. It's not lowering the bar. We're actually raising the bar and expecting people to be a little bit more rigorous and work a little harder and do a little better. So this is hard, and there is pushback. And it can be very uncomfortable because we're talking about systems of oppression, and we're trying to look at policy mechanisms to challenge things that are very embedded and for which systems have worked very well for a certain demographic. And there is resistance when you're accustomed to privilege. Equity feels like oppression. So, but we must link this back to rigor and inclusive excellence in science. Again, we're going for the best ideas. We're going for the best outputs. And we don't want to limit participation. We don't want to reduce the quality of outputs. And we want to use policy to drive the integration of those principles into science, because then we get better researchers doing better science. Okay, so I'll stop there. Yeah, that leaves us a little bit of time for some questions. That's quick flyover. Lots of resources, but let's see. We've got some interesting comments there. I will stop sharing. And maybe back to Megan, or do you want? Are there any questions in particular? Natasha.
Hi, thanks for taking my question, and also thank you for your talk. My question relates to a specific issue that I'm having. So I am in an EDI committee, and there has been a response saying that we need to recruit more diverse committee members, but I struggled in terms of not going into tokenism and recruiting specific people because they are from like a specific race or gender, etc.
Yeah, that happens a lot. So, and I think it depends on the circumstance. So, I mean, I can't speak to your specific circumstance, but I will say that happens a lot. And there's a couple of things that always come to mind for me. It's like, why do the underrepresented people have to do all the work? Like, we're not doing that anymore. I would like to see an EDI committee full of old, white, straight, middle-class, middle-aged men. And I would like to see them be required to come up with some strategies and some approaches that can be implemented. Because I think again, it comes back to that kind of numeric representation and the assumption that just because you're a woman in science, you're an expert on EDI in science. And you're not. And why should you be? Do you have a lived experience? Absolutely. Can you speak to your experience? Absolutely. And will that help inform your work? Absolutely. But there's, I think that, for those kind of committees where that's happening, there's a lot of people that often want to do good works. But the reality is that the work is very hard, and it really is only effective when it comes from a basis and a background of having some knowledge of the field. So, EDI committees that are, the ones that I've seen that I think are really well constructed have been ones where, for instance, an associate dean, so this is the situation at Carleton, or used to be, an associate dean had EDI under their portfolio, and they were responsible for putting together the committee. So it didn't matter who it was, because it was with the position. So the associate dean could change, was with the position. And then the associate dean went to the departments and asked the chairs to nominate someone and say, and then somebody with tenure, somebody was mid-career, it could be male, female, it didn't have to be somebody underrepresented, but there should be overall a goal to have a range of experiences and a range of points of view. And often we forget in that, because there's a focus on visible minorities, we forget, first generation, people with invisible disabilities, multi-generational caregivers, that kind of thing. So defining the terms of reference of an EDI committee and really setting out the plan, I think, can be helpful, and really having a tough discussion about why are you on this committee? What are we doing? What are the goals? How are we going to get there? And whose job is that? Because I do see a lot of, a lot of the dominant demographic, which is usually, but not always, white men, kind of sort of being let off the hook. I also know a lot of them who really want to participate, but are afraid because they will be told, you don't belong here. And actually, we need everybody, right? We need to call people in. So, so it can be tough. It can be tough, and it's a fine balance. But difficult conversations, we need to have those difficult conversations. Caitlin.
Hi, thank you so much, Dr. Coe, for that presentation. I'm involved in the Support Our Science campaign, which is asking the federal government to increase graduate student and postdoctoral funding to have a living wage. And obviously that has issues with EDI for not paying people, as you were saying, with volunteers appropriately. But this is often an issue that doesn't resonate well with the government, just looking at this through an EDI lens. So how would you recommend just having these discussions with policymakers or even with people with power within our own institutions in order to help them understand why it's such an important issue?
So I run into that a lot because, I've been told to stop banging on about women in science. And actually I'm talking about, well, don't you want better science? Like, don't you want the best science? And so I try, and I think with scientists and clinicians, to go back to the data and evidence and say, actually, there's a ton of data that show that we're not getting the best science, we're not doing the best, we're underperforming. So with policymakers, I think it's really important to frame it around, and not everybody's going to like this, but to avoid framing it around the moral imperative. To say we have to do it because it's the right thing to do. That doesn't carry water with policymakers. We might have to do it because we need to make sure that there's a little bit of money that goes everywhere from BC to to Newfoundland. And so there is a kind of the moral imperative for other aspects. For the moral imperative for diversifying science doesn't resonate as well. But the moral imperative for saying we're missing the boat on talent, ideas, innovation, because we're a small population, we can't afford to miss one bright idea. And then finding examples of how that one bright idea came from an unexpected place, I think can be helpful. So, and I think we overlook some of those unexpected places. Inner city kids, first generation, new immigrants who have great ideas but can't get into the system because our policies are really problematic. So I think those can be, and linking that to a missed opportunity for a new product or a new process or a new something that would have led us to be first or to have an advantage, but the company went to the US, or the vaccine development didn't get picked up. Those are the kinds of things that resonate a little bit better. I don't use the kind of, I don't use the we should do it because it's the right thing to do. I use we should do it because we can't afford not to do it because we're missing talent. I mean, there's a massive labor shortfall, and we're missing good ideas. And that I know that out there because I work with students and I hear from people who've left quantum computing. I hear from people who've left machine learning and AI because of a toxic tech bro culture, because they just are people who've left engineering because of the culture. So those are the ways I think can be more effective. And anecdotal data works much better with policymakers. It doesn't work with scientists, but it works with policymakers.
That's really helpful. Thank you. I appreciate that answer.
Anybody got examples of some great policy initiatives that are happening, things that I could use? Something that was the way, an old-fashioned way, but then a new policy came in, it sort of opened things up for people that maybe didn't have an opportunity previously. I mean, things like parental leave, some of the policies that we've been able to get put into place at NSERC, but not at CIHR, for instance. You know, there's some irrational kind of differences there. Holistic admissions for graduate entry, that kind of thing. I know that the building one comes up. I mean, the engineering building at U of T used to only have women's washrooms on every other floor. So, you know, policy around actually making sure the building is supportive. Lindsay.
Hi, I thought I'd just pop in to say I know the psychology graduate department at U of T recently changed their program so that the GRE isn't necessary. And I think that's kind of the case for a lot of psychology programs, at least across Canada, which is nice to see that they're not relying on, you know, standardized test scores anymore to make their choices. It's I feel like a small step, but a step nonetheless.
Small steps can have big impact. So, I mean, I think that's a really good change that has happened. I think there's a lot of, there's a big lack of understanding of the hidden curriculum. So, and the hidden curriculum being hugely impactful on who knows how to get through admissions processes. How do you know that? Well, you know that because your parents went to university, or you know that because you went to a school where there were counselors that walked you through it, that kind of thing. So the hidden curriculum is hugely impactful as well. So some of the training that I do involves really talking about privilege, identity, and belonging, and working through moving from EDI to talking about privilege, identity, and belonging, because that's how you experience lack of EDI in your particular environment. And privilege is a huge, huge issue, including and perhaps especially in science. Yeah, Natasha.
I'm not sure how EDI this is, but I think in my department or sciences, we removed the internal defense and just kept it more towards like an informal meeting with the committee to reduce stress on the grad students as they are going towards defense.
So and that's a great idea. I've always hated the word defense. I think language sometimes that we use, why do we call it a defense? Because you're going to be attacked. I mean, we could change language, right? We could just call things something different and they might have a small change, big impact. I don't know. But I will also say graduate students and trainees, graduate students in particular, you have significant amount of power to affect change on policies within your programs. I think that often isn't clear. It doesn't feel that way sometimes, but if you collectively say, this is what we need, as policy, we want specific training in our program for allyship, bystander intervention, that kind of thing. It needs to be part of our training. And you take that to, faculty of grad studies or something like that. It can be quite influential. Students demanding EDI related activities, it's harder to say no. So just think about the things that you maybe want to see within a program and think about ways to affect policy change that would lead to more inclusive kinds of environments. Yeah, so we have both institutionally and for the federal funding agencies, it's been a challenge to get them to really take on some of the issues associated with being a single parent. And I was a single parent with a 2-year-old and a 6-year-old, and told I couldn't take my children to a conference that I needed to attend for my particular science. So I think that's something that still is a bit of a battle ongoing. It's a challenge between federal and provincial jurisdictions. Universities sit under provincial jurisdictions. The funding world sits under federal jurisdictions. So it's easy to kind of pass the buck on that, but that is something that's on the radar that some of us are really trying to, get that awareness in place.
Okay, well, it looks like there are no more questions, so maybe we'll just wrap up here. I'll just share my screen. Okay, so yeah, I want to give a huge thanks to Dr. Imogen Coe. Thank you again for sharing your expertise. That was a really interesting discussion. I think we all learned a lot, so thank you so much. And we just want to invite everyone who attended here to an in-person event that we're having next week at the Grad Student Union Pub on U of T campus. So if anyone's looking to socialize with some current and former and future TSPN members, people who are interested in the science policy interface, please join us. You're welcome to come. And if you're interested in learning more about TSPN or volunteering at all, please join our Slack. That's the best way to keep kind of up on the events and volunteering opportunities. And you can also join our mailing list, and definitely feel free to reach out to any of the exec if you have any questions at all. We also just wanted to mention that you're all welcome to the annual general meeting that we'll be having on July 31st. So we're just going to talk about what we've accomplished and some new opportunities, and we're recruiting new members. So please join if you're interested. Related to that, we will be having our election soon, and nominations open next week. So again, please just reach out at all if you're interested at all. So thank you all so much for attending. Thank you again, Dr. Coe, for the great workshop. We just want to also say thanks to the SGS Sponsorship Fund for supporting today's event. I hope you all have a great rest of your day.